On a gentle slope of Main Street in Amherst, Massachusetts, there stands a large yellow house. Its brick walls have watched over the town since the early 19th century. Tall trees surround the property, their branches shifting slowly in the New England breeze. The windows are many, and they catch the morning light like quiet eyes. This house, known as the Dickinson Homestead, was the world of a woman whose voice would one day travel far beyond its walls. She rarely left it, yet inside those rooms she mapped the infinite landscapes of the soul. Tonight we step softly into that world. The house was built by Emily Dickinson's grandfather, Samuel Fowler Dickinson, a prominent lawyer and one of the founders of Amherst College. In 1830, when Emily was born, the family had moved into this dignified federal-style dwelling. Its central hallway was wide and cool, with a staircase curving upward into shadow. The rooms were spacious, filled with heavy furniture and the scent of beeswax candles. Every object seemed to hold its breath. The house stood apart from the road, with a white fence separating its garden from the public way, a border between the busy world and the quiet one inside. Edward Dickinson, Emily's father, was a stern but loving man who worked as a lawyer and later served in Congress. He was deeply involved in the civic life of Amherst. Yet at home, he upheld strict routines. The family gathered at set times for meals, and the children were taught duty and discipline. In spite of this formality, the homestead pulsed with a rich interior life. The library shelves held Shakespeare, Emerson, and the Bible. Letters arrived often from relatives and friends. This rhythm of ordered days and deep reading shaped Emily's mind from the very beginning. Her mother, Emily Norcross Dickinson, was a shy and quiet presence, devoted to the household. She tended to the kitchen and kept the linen closets orderly. Between mother and daughter there was an affection that was tender, but often expressed in silence. The older Emily rarely left the house either, creating a companionable stillness in the rooms. Lavinia, Emily's younger sister, brought a sharper wit and a love of cats into the daily routine. Together, the three women moved through the hallways like figures in a painting, their lives interwoven with the ticking of the tall clock in the hall. The homestead was more than a house, it was a container of memory and observation. From the parlor windows, Emily could watch the changing seasons on the common. She saw carriages pass and heard the distant bell of the college chapel. The view was both ordinary and profound. A slant of afternoon sun across the wallpaper could become, in her mind, a whole meditation on light and time. The ordinary objects of domestic life, a pitcher, a window sash, a single fly, would later appear in her poems as messengers from eternity. The house taught her to look closely. The kitchen at the back of the house was a warm domain of copper pots and the fragrance of baking bread. Emily was an accomplished baker, and she would often send a batch of gingerbread or a loaf of rye bread down to a neighbor child. The act of mixing ingredients, the waiting for dough to rise, became a quiet ritual. In a household where emotional expression was restrained, the giving of food was a language of care. The kitchen fire glowed red at dusk, and the curtains were drawn early, sealing the family inside a circle of warmth and lamplight. At night, the homestead settled into a deeper silence. The oil lamps were extinguished one by one, and only the wind stirred the elm trees outside. In her bedroom on the second floor, Emily sat by her small writing table, often until very late. The rest of the house slept while she wrote. In those hours, the boundary between the house and the universe seemed to dissolve. The walls were not a prison, but the edges of an experiment. She would pour her whole attention onto a scrap of paper and create a moment that has outlasted the house itself. And so the homestead on Main Street stood, neither grand nor humble, but exactly the right shape for a life that would turn inward with such astonishing grace. It was a place where the ticking of clocks was constant, where the garden grew wild, and where a woman in white could open a window and hear the infinite hum just behind the ordinary day. That hum would eventually become nearly 1,800 poems, folded and stitched into small booklets, waiting in a drawer. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us go back to the beginning, to a little girl learning to see. Emily Elizabeth Dickinson was born on the 10th of December, 1830, in the very homestead we have just visited. The winter light that day was probably thin and pale, the ground hard with frost. From her earliest moments, she was surrounded by the distinct seasons of western Massachusetts, the heavy snows, the sudden green of spring, the humid afternoons of July, and the furious color of October. This rhythmic change would become one of the deepest textures of her poetry. A child who watches the light shift across the same piece of earth for a lifetime learns something about eternity that cannot be taught in any school. She was the middle child, born between her brother Austin and her sister Lavinia. The three formed a small republic of their own in the upstairs rooms. Austin, a year and a half older, was lively and protective. Lavinia, 2 years younger, was sharp and loyal. Emily was the quiet one, yet already observant beyond her years. They played in the barn, chased butterflies in the meadow behind the house, and listened to their father's stories of the court and the legislature. The world felt secure and filled with wonder. The homestead was a kingdom of familiar smells and sounds, and the three children were its grateful citizens. The young Emily attended the Amherst Academy, a respected school just a short walk from the homestead. She was an excellent student, particularly drawn to botany, Latin, and literature. Her teachers noted a quick intelligence and a shy but eager participation in class. She collected wildflowers and pressed them in her books, naming them with care. This early discipline of looking closely at the natural world would never leave her. The academy building was a plain wooden structure, but inside it held maps of the world and globes that spun under the light. To a girl who already loved the details of a single petal, these objects were doors. After the academy, she attended Mount Holyoke Female Seminary in South Hadley, about 10 miles from home. There, the regimen was stricter, the religious climate more fervent. Mary Lyon, the founder, urged her students to profess their faith publicly. Emily, who had a rich spiritual life but resisted easy declarations, found herself unable to join the ranks of the converted. She was placed among those who were without hope. This experience confirmed something in her, that her inner life did not conform to categories. She returned home after only 1 year, in 1848, and never again lived anywhere else for more than brief visits. Back at the homestead, the 18-year-old Emily resumed her place in the household and in the social circles of Amherst. She was known as a clever young woman who could write a fine letter and play the piano with feeling. She attended local gatherings, went to the annual cattle show, and received callers in the parlor. She baked, she sewed, she read the newspapers. Yet even during these seemingly typical years, a shift was beginning. She started to withdraw, at first gently, then more distinctly. The change was so gradual that those who loved her hardly noticed. The garden gate was left unopened a little more often each season. What pulled her inward was not a single event, but a deepening relationship with the life of the mind. She read Emerson's essays and felt the thrill of a universe alive with spirit. She sat through long afternoons at her window and let her thoughts drift. She began to hear a cadence in common speech that others missed. The rhythm of a hymn, the sound of rain on the roof, the calls of birds at dawn, all of it was music. Slowly, the world outside became less necessary. The world inside was expanding with an almost frightening velocity. A few sheets of paper became her laboratory. During her 20s, Emily had not yet settled into the full seclusion that would mark her later years, but she was already forming the habits of a poet. She rose early and helped with the household tasks, then retreated to her room to write. Her handwriting began to slant with a new urgency. She experimented with words the way a chemist experiments with elements. No one yet knew that the scribbled lines she tucked into her sewing basket would one day be read in faraway cities. To the family, she was simply the capable daughter who sometimes excused herself from evening company with a small headache. The New England light that filled the homestead was her constant companion. In winter it was harsh and silver, reflecting off the snow and cutting sharp shadows across the floorboards. In summer it was golden and slow, sliding across the garden wall until late in the evening. She watched it every day and wrote it into her stanzas. There's a certain slant of light, / winter afternoons. The light was a teacher. It taught her that everything is fleeting and that the fleeting is everything. And so, before she was 30, Emily Dickinson had already become, in the quietest possible way, one of the great observers of the world. Behind the homestead, stretching down toward a small orchard, was the garden that Emily treasured above almost any other space on earth. It was not a formal garden with clipped hedges and gravel paths, but a generous New England flower garden, overflowing with old-fashioned blooms. Peonies, roses, lilacs, and sweet peas grew in abundant clusters. The borders were arranged so that something was always opening its petals to the sun. Emily moved through this garden like a quiet gardener, basket on her arm, scissors in hand. The garden gave her a world of texture and scent that words could translate into poems. She had a deep botanical knowledge that impressed those who knew her. In her letters, she referred to flowers by their Latin names and discussed their growing habits with the precision of a naturalist. Yet her love for them was not merely scientific. She experienced flowers as presences, companions almost, each with a personality. The shy violet, the proud tiger lily, the modest daisy, she addressed them in verse as if they could hear. In the garden, she was never lonely. The humming of bees and the rustle of leaves were a constant, gentle conversation. Her garden tasks were woven into the fabric of her day. In the early morning, when the dew was still heavy, she would walk the paths with her small dog, Carlo, a large Newfoundland who was her loyal companion for many years. Together they inspected the new blossoms and noted which plants needed staking. She carried the fragrance of crushed mint and lavender on her hands back into the house. These morning rituals grounded her. No matter how far her thoughts might travel during the night, the garden waited each dawn to bring her back to the tangible world of soil and growth. The Dickinson family conservatory, a small glass house attached to the homestead, allowed her to nurture plants even during the long New England winters. Inside, the air was warm and earthy. She grew ferns and forced bulbs, coaxing color from the dark months. This little conservatory became a sanctuary within a sanctuary. Through its glass panes, the pale winter sun fell on the green leaves, and Emily would stand there for long minutes, as still as the plants themselves. This quiet vigilance was, perhaps, its own form of prayer, a meditation on the persistence of life in cold ground. The flowers from her garden often appeared in the poems, not simply as decoration, but as the very heart of the meaning. A rose becomes a symbol of passion that exists beyond the grave. A lily stands for purity and also for death. A bee is a pagan reveler, drunk on the nectar of summer. The garden taught her that the natural world is a language. Every petal is a syllable, every season a different kind of sentence. She learned this grammar so deeply that she could speak it without thinking. To read her poetry is to walk through her garden again, even now. Beyond the cultivated beds, the wilder parts of the property also drew her. The orchard, with its gnarled apple trees, offered a rougher beauty. The meadow beyond the fence was a place to walk and think. She was a keen observer of the birds that visited the yard, the robins, the blue jays, the occasional hummingbird suspended in midair. She filled her letters with amazed descriptions of these creatures. A bird's song could stop her in her tracks and send her reaching for a pencil. The entire outdoor world was a living library of inspiration. In the afternoons, if the weather was fine, she might sit on the steps of the piazza, the covered porch that faced the garden. From there, she could see the whole sweep of her small kingdom. Light moved across the lawn, birds flitted among the leaves, and the distant hills of the Connecticut River Valley rolled toward the horizon. She sat very still, a woman in white, and let the peace of the place settle into her bones. Strangers walking along Main Street might catch a glimpse of her and wonder who she was. They could not know they were seeing one of America's greatest poets in her natural habitat. The garden was more than a hobby, it was a collaborator. It gave her images that she transformed into meditations on time, love, grief, and resurrection. In a life that withdrew from society, the garden remained a society of its own. The flowers did not demand conversation, yet they spoke volumes. The seasons turned, the blossoms faded and returned, and Emily watched it all with a tender, unbroken attention. Her garden, in the end, became a metaphor for the whole of her existence, beautiful, rooted, and wildly alive in secret. Let us now climb the curving staircase of the homestead and walk quietly down the hall to the southwest corner bedroom. This was Emily Dickinson's room, her sanctuary and her workshop. The room itself was simple: a single bed, a bureau, a washstand, and a small square writing table by the window. The walls were papered with a modest pattern. But from that window, she could see the garden, the orchard, the roofs of Amherst, and, on clear days, the distant range of the Holyoke Hills. This view was her constant canvas. For the final decades of her life, she rarely left this room, yet from it she traveled everywhere. The heart of the room was the writing table, no larger than an ordinary lap desk. On it rested a few sheets of paper, a pen, and a bottle of ink. There was no mechanical typewriter, no printed books of her own. She wrote by hand, rapidly, in a script that became more distinctive with the years. When an idea arrived, she seized it on whatever was nearest: the back of an envelope, a scrap of brown paper, the margin of a newspaper. These fragments were later gathered and, during the night, copied into small booklets, the famous fascicles that she stitched together with her own needle and thread. Her process was as private as prayer. She often wrote at night, after the household had gone to sleep. The lamp burned low, and the house settled into absolute silence. In that stillness, she could hear the inner music most clearly. The meter of her poems borrowed the rhythm of Protestant hymns, but she disrupted it with unexpected dashes and strange, slant rhymes. This was not carelessness, but a deliberate craft. She was building a new way of speaking that could hold the pressure of her thought. The dashes were breaths, pauses, moments of vertigo before the next word. The quiet hum of the lamp was the only audience. Upstairs, she developed a legendary reclusiveness that became part of the town's quiet folklore. She no longer came down to greet visitors. Instead, she might listen from the top of the stairs or speak to them through a door. She called this her polar privacy. Yet this solitude was not empty. It was fiercely populated by the life of the mind. Her room was filled with books, although she rarely joined the library circuit. Shakespeare, the Brownings, George Eliot, and the Bible were her close friends. They never required small talk. She could converse with them at midnight and pause whenever she pleased. In the drawers of her bureau, the poems accumulated. There were hundreds, then over 1,000. She showed them to only a few. Her sister-in-law Susan, who lived next door at the Evergreens, was perhaps the most frequent reader. Emily would send a poem across the lawn with a child or tucked into a bouquet of flowers. The intimacy of this exchange was deep and complex. Susan, a sharp intellect herself, responded with encouragement and criticism. This hidden correspondence nourished Emily's work. The poems, like the letters, traveled only a few hundred feet, yet each one was a missive from the edge of human experience. What did she look like during those writing years? Only one authenticated daguerreotype survives, taken when she was a teenager. Later, she refused to sit for photographs. Visitors who glimpsed her described a slender figure in white, gliding through the garden or moving down the hallway like a quiet flame. She adopted white clothing almost exclusively in her later years, a choice that has been interpreted as both a rejection of fashion and a statement of her inner life. The white dress became her uniform, a sign of her devotion to something invisible but real. To see her in the garden at dusk, in white, was to see a ghost who was profoundly alive. The room upstairs held more than paper. It held the pressure of a lifetime of attention. The floorboards creaked in familiar patterns. The window reflected candlelight back at her. She could hear the bell of the First Congregational Church tolling the hours. These sensations wove themselves into the fabric of her verse. A fly buzzing against the window pane became, in her hands, the most haunting image of death. A slant of light became the heavy weight of divine revelation. Nothing was too small to bear the full weight of the eternal. Upstairs in that room, the universe was constantly being born anew. Though Emily Dickinson rarely left her room, she was far from isolated. Her letters were her social life, her intellectual conversation, and her art. She wrote to family, to friends, and to a few chosen correspondents with an intensity that made each envelope a tiny book. The mail carrier who walked the route from Amherst to the outer world carried more of her thoughts than he could ever know. A letter from Emily was a performance, a mixture of poetry, confession, and riddle. Those who received them often kept them as treasures, sensing that something precious had arrived on ordinary paper. The most important literary relationship of her life began with a letter she sent to Thomas Wentworth Higginson, an essayist and former minister, in 1862. She had read his advice to young writers in The Atlantic Monthly and, with a boldness that surprised even herself, enclosed 4 of her poems along with a note asking, "Are you too deeply occupied to say if my verse is alive?" The letter was signed with a name she would often use, "Your friend, E. Dickinson." This began a correspondence that would last over 2 decades, in which Higginson served as a kind of distant mentor. Higginson was puzzled and intrigued by the poems. They did not follow conventional rules. The rhymes were off-kilter, the rhythms strange. He urged her to write more regularly and to delay publication, not yet recognizing their genius. But he kept writing, and she sent him many more poems. Her letters to him are full of luminous phrases that we now recognize as the language of her poetry. "I find that being myself is the only way to be," she wrote. They met in person only twice, both times in Amherst. He described her as intense and childlike, a white-clad figure who spoke in bursts of brilliance. He never fully understood her, but he never forgot her. Another important figure in her correspondence was Helen Hunt Jackson, a popular writer and childhood acquaintance who reconnected with Emily in later years. Jackson was one of the few who understood the magnitude of Emily's talent. She begged her to publish a collection, even offering to act as her literary executor. Emily thanked her but resisted. The privacy of her work was essential to its integrity. Jackson did manage to include a single poem, "Success is Counted Sweetest," in a volume called A Masque of Poets, though the author was listed as anonymous. It was one of the very few poems to see print in her lifetime. Her deepest epistolary relationship, however, may have been with her sister-in-law Susan Huntington Gilbert Dickinson, who lived just next door at the Evergreens. For nearly 40 years, Emily sent Susan poems, notes, and small gifts. Their bond was complex, intimate, sometimes strained, but intellectually rich. Susan was an intelligent critic, and Emily sought her opinion more than anyone's. In return, Susan provided a steady, listening presence. The 2 houses were connected by a narrow path through the garden, a physical link that mirrored the steady flow of words between them. Some of Emily's greatest lyrics were first read in Susan's parlor. Her letters to her brother Austin and sister Lavinia were full of affection and the daily details of the homestead. She used language playfully, coining nicknames and code-like phrases. The family was a tight unit, and even as she retreated from the public world, she remained deeply connected to them through the written word. A note left on the kitchen table could be as carefully composed as a sonnet. She understood that the ordinary domestic message could be elevated into art. Every scrap of writing she produced, no matter how casual it seemed, was crafted with care. There were also letters to a few close friends, including cousins and neighbors, in which she opened her mind on matters of faith and doubt, love and loss. She was a consummate consoler. When someone in the town suffered a death, a note from Emily would appear, filled with gentle, startling images that reframed grief as a passage rather than an ending. These condolence letters are some of the most profound prose documents in American literature. They show a woman utterly acquainted with sorrow and yet luminous with hope. The letters traveled out from her room like doves, carrying peace. Today, her letters are studied almost as carefully as her poems. They reveal a mind that could not stop making metaphor, that saw the universe in a teacup, that spoke to everyone with the same intensity she gave to God and nature. Through them, we can trace the growth of her genius year by year. The mailbag from Amherst was, in retrospect, a vessel of extraordinary treasure. Those who burned their letters from Emily, as some did at her request, lost an irreplaceable piece of literary history. But enough survived to let us hear, still, the voice that spoke into the silence between two houses and across a meadow and into the world. The 1880s arrived softly at the homestead. Emily was in her 50s, and her world had shrunk to the smallest of circles. She rarely left her room now, and she saw only her immediate family. Yet her inner life had not dimmed. The poems kept coming, though at a slower pace. The rhythm of the garden visible from her window still marked the seasons. She sat at the writing table, thinner and paler than in her youth, but with eyes that held a perpetual alertness. The white dress she wore had become a kind of uniform of readiness, ready for what no one could say. Perhaps she was simply waiting, like a soul attentive to a signal. In June of 1884, she suffered a seizure while baking in the kitchen. It was the first sign that her body was beginning to fail. The family called the doctor, and she was carried upstairs to the room she would never again leave for more than a few steps. Even then, she maintained her unwavering sense of self. She wrote to a friend, "The crisis of the sorrow of so many years is all that tires me." Her language remained as precise and strange as ever. The illness confined her body, but her mind continued its restless travel. The window was still enough. The last 2 years were marked by a series of losses. Her dear nephew Gilbert, only 8 years old, died of typhoid fever. His death devastated the family. Emily, who loved him deeply, was too unwell to attend the funeral. She grieved from her bed, channeling her sorrow into the few poems she could still manage. Her faithful dog, Carlo, had already been gone a few years. Helen Hunt Jackson, her literary friend, died in 1885. The world outside her room seemed to be receding, and yet she faced it with an almost astonishing equanimity. She understood that life was a series of partings. Her brother Austin and sister Lavinia were her constant companions during those final months. Austin came every day from next door and sat with her. Lavinia, who had devoted her life to the household, became her tireless caregiver. The two sisters, so different in temperament, grew closer than ever. Lavinia read to her, adjusted the pillows, and kept the room filled with flowers from the garden that Emily could no longer visit. The fragrance of lilacs and roses drifted up from the grounds, a silent messenger from the world below. In the quiet of that sick room, love was expressed in the simplest of actions. On the 15th of May, 1886, Emily Dickinson died. She was 55 years old. The official cause was Bright's disease, a kidney ailment that had slowly worn her down. Her funeral took place in the Homestead library, the very room where she had once listened to her father read aloud. The service was brief and simple. Her body was carried out the back door, through the garden she had loved so deeply, and across the meadow to West Cemetery, a route she had imagined many times in her poems. The day was bright with spring, the apple trees in blossom. After the funeral, Lavinia began the task of sorting through her sister's possessions. She knew Emily wrote poetry, but she had no idea how much. When she opened the locked drawer of the writing desk, she found the notebooks, 40 little hand-sewn booklets containing nearly 1,800 poems. Lavinia was stunned. She had promised Emily to destroy her letters, which she mostly did, but the poems were not mentioned. With a sense of sacred duty, Lavinia resolved to see them into print. The world would now hear the voice that had been speaking in that upstairs room for decades. The journey to publication was not easy. Lavinia turned to Susan for help, but progress was slow. Eventually, she enlisted Mabel Loomis Todd, a family friend and the wife of an Amherst college professor, to help transcribe and edit the poems. Todd worked tirelessly, painstakingly decoding Emily's difficult handwriting. Thomas Wentworth Higginson was brought in to write a preface. In 1890, just 4 years after Emily's death, the first volume of Poems by Emily Dickinson was published. It was an immediate success, going through multiple printings. The Quiet Woman of Amherst was suddenly a literary sensation. The poems that emerged were unlike anything the reading public had encountered. Their compressed power, their startling metaphors, their refusal to offer easy comfort, all of it felt utterly new. The first edition smoothed out some of her punctuation and rhymes, But even in altered form, the genius shone through. Over the following decades, more volumes appeared, and scholars began the long work of restoring her original texts. What had been hidden in a drawer was now taught in universities, cherished by readers, and set to music. Emily Dickinson, who had sought no fame, had achieved an immortality that few poets ever reach. And so, from a quiet house on Main Street in Amherst, a voice reached across the years. The garden still blooms, the conservatory still stands, and the writing desk remains by the window as if waiting. The poems are no longer locked away. They are free to anyone who opens a book and listens. In the stillness of night, they still speak of love, of death, of the light that falls on a winter afternoon. And for the listener, there is a sense that Emily herself is not gone, but only paused, her words floating in the air like the softest of music, ready to accompany us into sleep.